All right. Well, let's get underway. So this last week we looked at Old Testament dates. This week we're going to focus more on New Testament. As I said last week, there is actually no there's, it's not like we had to get to any point. If we got into such a good discussion on point two or something that we use the hour, that's fine. It's not like we've got to cover any particular curriculum thing. So let's just see how it all goes. Turn that off so it's not bouncing back noise. Okay, so just a quick reminder what we're doing in this, and the reason we're starting it off now during this April-May period is to give people a taste of the kind of things we can do if we have a single service and time a bit later in the morning to do other things. So next Sunday we're getting a Fifth Sunday sample, and these couple of weeks and a couple of weeks following after next weekend, we'll do a couple more. The topics will come up in a moment, but and I'll just the idea is just to give people a sense of what are the kinds of things we could be doing on a Sunday morning if we're not doing multiple services one after the other. And hopefully the services themselves, or service itself, is also giving people a taste of the kind of worship we can do when we're putting all our eggs into one basket, rather than kind of dividing ourselves between a couple. The reason I think it's really important to have an adult faith education program is that if you're growing trees, if you've got fruit trees or whatever in your backyard, as I do at the deanery, and if you don't ever fertilise them and give them a bit of food, after a while they're going to stop producing nice fruit. And if all we do is rush around doing stuff, putting on services, running programs, running the op shop, whatever, and don't have opportunities to stop and actually grow ourselves, then our spiritual capacity is going to become stilted at the very least. We're just going to be doing things by habit rather than really kind of being refreshed and renewed in the process. So I hope whatever happens with the Sunday service times, we've got to find a way to offer some sort of quality time for some faith education stuff. It's actually very popular in the Anglican Church in the US, which of course is called the Episcopal Church. It's just normal there for there to be an adult Sunday school program on Sunday morning. We haven't had that tradition in Australia, usually because our priests are heading off to do 6 other services, whatever, 2 or 3 other services on a circuit. So we haven't had kind of developed the pattern of having planned adult education. It won't just be church people that are coming over time. Well, I'm sure, and I know we've got some people planning to join us who are not coming to worship, but they participated in the Lenten study group, and they're really excited about the possibility of being able to check in with these from time to time. And I hope it'll become a place where we can explore questions. In a sermon, I've got 10 minutes or so to kind of try and map out a bit of a space, give a bit of a pep talk, encouragement, whatever. But sometimes we'll use these forums to tease out ideas at more length, talk about them more thoroughly. It is very much about exploring. It's not about, like I said before, there's no set curriculum, and you certainly don't have to end up however long this series is, you don't have to come out the other end thinking like me. That's not what we're trying to achieve. But if you come out the other end being able to think more independently about questions of faith, then I'm a happy camper. Okay? So last thing I need is a whole lot of people sitting in the pews who think just like me. I'd stop going to that church and go somewhere else. We need to develop our own voice. Starting tomorrow, actually, the electricians are here to start putting in the high-speed Wi-Fi network. So once I learn how to use it, we'll also be able to live stream these kind of events, live stream services, whatever. So people, if they can't get to church, can still participate to some degree. I've already had one suggestion, which I hope I can remember soon. After church this morning, somebody suggested one of the topics to look at would be to look at the Israel-Palestine kind of situation, given some of my background in that area. So that's a topic for sometime down the track.
Great. Will those live streams go out to listen homes?
They'll be available to anybody who's on the internet. Yeah. So if you, and who's on decent enough Wi-Fi to be able to stream it, of course. Yeah. I mean, the main advantage in the short term will be like the recording of last week's session took 12 hours to upload, because that's how slow. Yeah, that's how slow the broadband is in Duke Street. Okay, it took 12 hours to upload. If I was at home in Brisbane, that would probably take 10 minutes. And after this week, it should take like 2 minutes to upload. It should be very quick. So we can actually generate content and share it much more easily. That's also part of the cathedral becoming a kind of theological resource for other parts of the diocese. So if there are events happening here, instead of people having to drive down our lovely highway, in some cases it'll be appropriate to participate and even to have sort of live interaction back and forth with them asking questions in a live event. So it gives us some capacity to use the technology. So the topics we're looking at last week was Old Testament focus. Today we're looking at some key moments in the New Testament storyline. Next week's not really a Dean's Forum, but it's a fifth Sunday, so we're going to get together and we'll do a forum about what's happening with our finances, what are we hoping to do with some strategic projects, and we've got 2 bits of really exciting news to share with people. The following week we're going to do a session around the basically geography of the Holy Land. I'm just calling it Mapping the Holy Land. And then the May the 13th is when I'll do a session on Nazareth in the first century. Okay? So, just some opening comments about the first century. When we talk about the first century, we mean, of course, the first century in our current calendar. So it's 2018 now, so we're talking about that 12-month period that occurred 2018 years ago. We think. We actually don't know that they kept the dates absolutely kosher during the Middle Ages and didn't mess things up. We could be 30 or so years out of date, so I'm either a very young man or a very old man. No, the amount of time I've been alive is still okay. So we're looking at what we call the first century. And bearing in mind, nobody living in the first century knew they were first century people. That's our category, it's our label. Okay? Which is different from, say, the first people living in Grafton, first Europeans living in Grafton, knew they were the first Europeans to come and live in Grafton. They were conscious of doing something new and sort of setting things up. Okay?
They were pioneers.
Yeah, well, they knew they were, and these folk were pioneers, but they
Didn't know.
They might have known they were pioneers, but they didn't think of themselves as first century pioneers and so on. Similarly, when Paul wrote letters to Corinth or whatever, he didn't realise he was writing the second part of the Bible. He was just writing a letter to sort out a problem in a local church. He didn't know that 2,000 years later, on another side of a world that he thought was flat but isn't, there'd be groups of people sitting in Grafton discussing his words and trying to make sense of them. He'd be somewhat gobsmacked, I think, to realise just what has happened there. So there are labels, not theirs. And there are kind of 2 first centuries we're playing with this morning. One first century is the first century, the first 100 years after Easter, the first 100 years of Christianity, okay? Which is basically from 30 to 130 on our calendar. The other first century, of course, is what we call the first century, and that's the lifetime of Jesus, more or less. We actually we'll talk about in a moment, we don't know when he was born, but there's the first 30 years before Easter, and then there's the next 70 years until we get to what we call the year 100. So we've got, even when we talk about the first century, is it the first 100 years of after Easter, or is it the first century? And we'll be sort of playing with that difference, I suspect, as we go along. And as always, anytime I use a bit of technical jargon, just throw a hymn book at me or something, or new bottle or something at me, just say woo woo, talk plain. And if you wanted to stop and tease anything out at any stage, that's fine as well. So we're going to do what we did last week, in a sense, and start by just pulling what we already know about key moments in the New Testament story. Now, obviously, one difference is last week the Old Testament story covers hundreds, if not thousands of years. Certainly the way the story is told, even just from Abraham on, it's about 2,000 years in that story. And if you take the Old Testament story further back to Noah or whatever, well, you're talking about zillions of years. I mean, who knows how many years we're talking about, okay? In the case of the New Testament, we are basically talking about 100 years. Okay? In that, the New Testament is finished at the end of this process. It's not yet become scripture, but certainly, even somebody with reasonably radical dating suggestions like I have, by the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century, the New Testament is finished. It's done. It's written. And there's a bit of room to argue a decade here or there, but we're only talking at most, even from the birth of Jesus to the finishing off of the document in the New Testament, we're only talking about, say, 150 years or so of time, which is rather different from the Old Testament, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Another difference is that everything is Greek. It's a Greek world. Because of Alexander the Great, the world, as in the Mediterranean world, which was the only world these people knew of, the world is Greek. Yes, they don't know it, but a few thousand kilometres away there's India with a totally independent Hindu culture that's thousands of years old, and further east there's China, and way to the west there's the Aztecs, but they don't know that. As far as they're concerned, the world is Greek, and anybody who doesn't speak Greek, their word for them was barbarian, because they couldn't speak Greek. They were barbars. They just went blah, blah, blah. You couldn't make any sense of them. That's where the word barbarian comes from. Couldn't speak Greek, barbarian. Okay. All right, so it's a Greek world, and even when Rome takes over, that's analogous to the US rising to power, but it's still really the Anglophone. It's really, the American Empire is really just the British Empire with the post office box moved to Washington. It's not the German Empire, it's not the Russian Empire. It's still the English dominance of the global scene. So in a sense, the Roman Empire was what happens when the Greek Empire is now operating out of Rome rather than Antioch or wherever. Okay, so let's just pull some suggestions. What are some dates, or if you don't have dates, some events or moments in the New Testament story that we're probably going to have to try and get them in some sort of sequence? Suggestions. So the birth of Jesus? Yep, okay. I'll write some of these up over here just to remind us of them. So birth of Jesus. So, we know Jesus was born, okay? Where and when's a whole other story, but we know he was born. That's not... First, that's not in the debate, sorry? First of the first, wasn't it? Oh, right. In the year 1 or minus 1? Oh, right, or 0. Yeah, okay. All right, so birth of Jesus will be one of the key events in a New Testament kind of timeline. Yep. What other kind of things? There's some obvious things coming, I'm sure. The death of Jesus. All right. So we're going to have the cross or the death of Jesus. Yep. And that's a little bit easier to date because, and this is probably another thing to go on the list in a moment, because we know the dates when Pontius Pilate was in office. So therefore, if there's any historicity to the point that Jesus was killed during the time that Pontius Pilate was procurator of Judea, then we know it has to be in a certain timeline within those couple of years. Yep. What other events?
Do we know much about the disciples, what they did after the death of Jesus?
Okay. Oh, shit. Good question. Notice I'm cleverly not answering it. after Easter. I'll just put the cross there, but it can mean Easter as well as Good Friday. Yeah, so after Easter, the disciples obviously did something, or we wouldn't be sitting here 2,000 years later talking about it. So there's some kind of activity by the followers of Jesus that we tend to call disciples or apostles, but let's use plain language, sort of home-brand language. So the followers of Jesus didn't just pack up and say, "Well, that was a good idea," and they kept going. So there's a whole bag of things there. Yep. What other things might we?
All on the road to Damascus.
Uh-huh. So not only the followers of Jesus, but Paul becoming a Christian, becoming a follower of Jesus, becoming a disciple, if you like. I've left it a bit vaguer than on the Damascus Road, but Paul, and I haven't said Paul converting, because he doesn't actually stop being Jewish, and he doesn't join a thing called Christianity. So Paul doesn't convert from Jewish to Christian, but he certainly becomes a Jewish follower of Jesus, a disciple. But he's in a league of his own, because half the New Testament is written by Paul or people pretending to be Paul. If you throw in Luke and Acts as well, it's an even bigger chunk of the New Testament. Okay. All right, so we've got a few dates there.
Could we just go back and put baptism of Jesus in there?
Sure. Somewhere in between, obviously. We've got, yep. And that of course also brings up the issue of John the Baptist.
That's right.
And because John the Baptist doesn't mean he went to the hub. Okay. It means John the Baptizer. Or I like, if I'm teasing people, I like to say Jack the Dipper. Okay? Not the Ripper, Jack the Dipper. Okay, it's not a church brand, it's an activity. He was famous because he did something really weird. He baptized Jewish people, and Jewish people never got baptized. Pagans got baptized when they were becoming Jewish. But so to tell good Jewish people they had to be baptized, interesting. That's why that's his most distinctive activity. Okay, so we've got about 5 categories there to start with. Yeah.
What about when Jesus came back to the disciples?
So you're talking about Easter appearances?
Yeah.
Yep. So, okay. Look, I just happened to leave a space there. It wasn't actually with that in mind, but that'll work just perfectly. So whether it's the Emmaus Road or whatever, there are various Easter appearances. Yep. Anything else? I've sort of put them into a kind of, I guess it's a logical sequence. Birth comes before baptism, baptism comes before death, death comes before Easter appearances, and so on. So there is a kind of a logical sequence to those 6 or 7 lines over there. We haven't put dates on them yet. We're just getting a rough sequence. Okay. And therein lies the problem. All of these dates, all of these moments, if you like, are effectively undateable. But we do have some known dates for this period. Where are those dates likely to come from? Yeah.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yes.
If we know that's the order in roughly in which things happen, what do the dates really matter in the story of Jesus and God's?
Yep. The dates may not matter that much at all. That's a good point. The dates, if we can date something, we're more confident that it happened. So there is this little bit of a tweak there where dating can be useful. But for instance, whether we know the exact date and circumstances of Paul becoming a follower of Jesus, he clearly did. So you're right. Yeah. The moment or the event is more significant.
Then whether it's Monday or Friday, sort of.
Yeah. Yep.
And we're talking
But
about dates. We have Easter, Good Friday, a different day of the year.
That's to do with the calendar. Yeah, exactly.
When we're talking dates, what does the date really matter? And it seems to be theologians and people who spend a lot of time delving into these mysteries
Sure.
spend 3/4 of their life arguing about the date. And does it matter? I can't understand, does it matter?
Yeah. Okay.
Everyone
So
Christ-
at one level it doesn't matter, but dates are part of the question of historicity. And historicity doesn't matter totally. Like something can be very, very true but never have happened, like the Garden of Eden story. Nobody's going to, well, some people will, but most of us are not going to try and put a...
Father Christmas to a 2-year-old.
We're not,
True.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So stories can be true irrespective of actual historicity.
Yeah.
But being able to put a date on them it plays into the question of having confidence that something happened. It also it allows us then to put some of the things in context. Like if Jesus is born in the Herodian period, in the time of Herod the Great and his sons, and in fact, if he lives and dies within the Herodian dynastic period, then that tells us some of the dynamics going on around him in his lifetime, and some of the power politics and then the fact that one of Herod's 3 boys was such a loser that he was sacked from being in charge of Jerusalem, and Rome took it over directly. That's why Pontius Pilate is there. Okay, and if there hadn't been a Roman administrator, there wouldn't have been a crucifixion, because crucifixion was something Romans did to non-Romans, never to other Romans. Okay, so it kind of helps us get a feel, but you're right, we don't have to be fixated over arguing whether, for instance, the Last Supper happened on the night before Passover or the day before that, or whether Jesus was crucified in the year 30 or 33. And they're the 2 major dates circulating around. So yeah, I would agree at one level, at one level, that doesn't matter that much. Okay, so yeah, let's not think if we can date something, that's it, or we've somehow climbed Mount Everest. We may just have been fiddling around the bottom of the mountain and never actually getting on with the journey. Yeah, okay. I remember years ago when I first went to Drayton Parish, the colleague who was my assistant there was very keen to put a paragraph in the bulletin every Sunday. It was a little paragraph of kind of what I would call Bible trivia. And I said, why are we doing this? People don't need to know that stuff. I'd rather have you out on the road going to visit somebody than spending 2 hours looking up some obscure thing to write a 200-word paragraph to stick in the bulletin. Because at one level, the detail doesn't matter most of the time, provided we've got the big picture in our head. And that's where these kind of 10 things. Having said that, there are some dates, and they'll come out of the world of politics. They're not going to come out of the biblical story. So we do know the dates for Herod the Great, and we do know the dates for Pontius Pilate and so on. We do know the date when the Romans captured Jerusalem and burnt the temple to the ground. So we do have a few known dates, but they're actually dates that are kind of independent of the New Testament story, but they provide the framework for the story to go in. So let's have a look at how that might look. This is not as nice as it might be. It could also just be the graphics not that good. Ah, that's a bit better. It wasn't your eyes, okay? It wasn't your eyes. So this is the parallel timeline to what we looked at last year, and if people want these, we can arrange to get them printed off. So as I said there, this is something I actually did years ago in Deception Bay when I was in my first parish and doing a kind of home discussion group. So the actual New Testament part of this really only begins here, okay, with around the time of Herod the Great, Annunciation and so on. So it's as I said, it's a relatively short story. But in order to understand that story, you've probably got to have a bit of a sense of what happened between the end of the Old Testament and the start of the New Testament. And I've got several things in there. Probably the most important thing to note is where I've got that sort of menorah, the 7-branch candlestick, the Maccabean Revolt, 167 BCE. That's when the Jewish people gain some degree of political independence and form an independent Jewish nation again for the first time in 400 or 500 years. Now, it's all going to end in tears about 200 years later. But there's a 200-year window when the Jewish people are basically self-governing. And the reason they're self-governing is because they've got rid of the Syrian empire that was controlling them, because way over on the western horizon there's an emerging power in a place called Rome. And Rome did rather like Rome did last week with the Syrians. It didn't send in missiles, but Rome literally sent a representative who drew a line in the sand, literally drew a line in the sand, and said, if you take your soldiers over that line, you are at war with Rome. Okay, and so Antiochus IV huffed and puffed and didn't blow the house down, but went back to Syria. Okay, now the events that triggered by that intervention eventually lead to the Jewish rebellion, which is backed by Rome. Rome is the guarantor of Jewish independence from the Syrian regime, what's called the Seleucid Empire. 200 years later, the rebellion is going to be a Jewish rebellion against Rome. So you can see what has happened in the course of 200 years. Jews and Romans have gone from being allies to being opponents in roughly a 200-year period, 230 years, whatever. Okay, from 167, and the Jewish revolt breaks out in 66. So basically 200 years. Okay. In between the Maccabean revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, everything to do with Jesus has to happen. It can't be after the temple is destroyed, and there was no Jewish kingdom there prior to that date. So again, just in terms of zooming in, that 200-year period is when the birth of Christianity has to happen. Okay. Now, in fact, it's even more narrower than that, because it's actually all to do with this guy, and with the dynamics that are set up. And he dies probably before Jesus is born, or around the time Jesus is born. He dies, but the dysfunctional dynastic succession that followed is exactly the political framework for the period of Jesus' life. Okay? Jesus, at a different point in history, would have had different stuff he had to deal with because of what was going on around him. So let's look at some of these in more detail. So I won't give you that one. So although I said, well, I wanted 10, I'm giving you 11, like the 10 Commandments, because I wanted to mention this one. Okay, so in a sense, bracketed out, it's not in the New Testament story, but it's what sets up everything for the New Testament story. Okay? And indeed, it's only because of the Hasmonean dynasty that there were Jewish people living in the Galilee. And Herod the Great, actually his first job was to be the Hasmonean governor of the Galilee. That's where he established his reputation as a mean sod who could run a tight show. So he gets the job of being king of the Jews. So the Maccabean revolt, which leads to the Hasmonean dynasty, same family, that really sets up everything in the New Testament. But you will rarely hear anything about the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans in church. Okay, so Bill, you haven't been on parish council since 1954, unlike Alan. Actually, Alan was 59, I found out during the week, not 54. You were exaggerating. So his wife pointed out to me on Wednesday. But anyway, I mean, you've been around this place a long time. How many times have you heard reference to the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans? None? Probably never, yeah. Yet without that more or less successful Jewish dynasty, which lasted the best part of 200 years, whatever happened with Jesus would have been totally different. Okay, so it's really we don't talk about it much in church, but the Maccabean, Hasmonean, Herodian dynasties, which is about a 200. In fact, the last Herodian, Agrippa II, only dies at about 96. So it lasts about 250 years. And that really sets up the story, even though the revolt itself is not part of the story. So the story changes in 63 BC. A Roman general called Pompey, and they love these titles. He's Pompey the Great. Okay? And of course, shortly we're going to be talking about Herod the Great. So yeah, they liked it on their business card. Magnus, I'm the big one. So he's basically extending Roman control over the Eastern Mediterranean and taking it off the Seleucids, which was the dynasty in charge of Syria, and also taking it off the Ptolemies, who were the people running Egypt at the time. And the most famous Ptolemy for us is a lady called Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies. Okay? So again, this is kind of the period where we're in.
What sort of population are we talking about at this time?
In what? In Palestine?
Yeah.
Well, Jerusalem itself was probably a city of about 20,000. Okay. So a bit,
That sounds good.
a little bit, yeah. Physically smaller than Grafton. Population-wise, not much different from Grafton. Okay. And it was basically, as we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, the land of Palestine was basically agricultural land. So farming of one kind or another, whether it's fishing or whatever, or so growing olives, running sheep, and so on. That's the primary economic activity. Fairly narrow economic base. Very few strategic advantages because it's not really on the road to anywhere. So it's not going to be a market-driven commercial kind of. A bit like Grafton, really. It's no longer on the highway. Okay. So Rome takes over. Now, this is a really rude shock as well. I mean, the heart of the Maccabean revolt was an attempt to suppress Jewish worship and to have worship of the pagan god, the pagan king, set up in the Jewish temple. And it blew the roof off the place and ended up, they became independent. 100 years, almost exactly 100 years later, Rome arrives in the person of Pompey with his soldiers, and Pompey goes into the temple, like any visiting conqueror, says, show me what you've got here. Show me your temple. And Pompey not only goes to the temple, he walks into the Holy of Holies. Okay? Now, who's allowed to go into the Holy of Holies? One person only. The high priest, and only once a year. Pompey is a pagan Roman conqueror, and no one's going to say, you can't go in there, sir. Like, you want your head cut off? Okay? So Pompey goes in, and he comes in and says, there's nothing in there. Just a dusty room. There's not even an idol, which of course it's a Jewish temple. Okay? And there was no Ark of the Covenant anymore. But what was even a bigger shock was God did not strike Pompey dead when he broke the most important rule of the Jewish religion. Okay? Now that's a serious cultural, psychological shock for the Jewish people. When we go in there, you'll be dead. Pompey says, well, I went in there and all I saw was cobwebs. Don't you ever clean this place? Okay? 100 years later, next page, 100 years later, of course, more or less, the temple's going to be destroyed by the Romans. Again, and God does not stop them from doing it. So psychological and spiritual and theological crises compounding for the Jewish people through this period. That's all part of the dynamic. You then got the Roman civil wars, which we know about from school, in particular between, of course, Julius Caesar and Octavian. and Mark Antony, Julius Caesar was slightly before and had been murdered, and basically his successor was Mark Antony, who was having an affair with Cleopatra and had set himself up as basically the emperor of the East, and his opponent was Octavian, who set himself up as the protector of Roman Orthodoxy and was going to reunite the empire. So you have a civil war which finishes in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium. So you can see Herod is already been king of the Jews from 37, appointed king of the Jews, on the nomination of Mark Antony, with the vote being put through the Senate in Rome. So, but Herod, because he's in Palestine in the east, he's an ally of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and that side just lost the civil war. So you would expect Herod's going to lose his job. No, he's one clever man. He rushes off to meet up with Octavian, who's going to become known as Augustus, and he pledges his loyalty to Octavian and says, I can run the place really good for you, mate. And so he holds on to his job as the puppet king, the king of the Jews, even though he was on the losing side of the civil war. Cleopatra takes a snake bite, Mark Antony is dead, Herod survives. He's an operator. Very clever operator. That's not, of course, how we think about him in the New Testament, is it, in church? He's the guy in the dark suit, okay? But he's the Rasputin figure, but he's actually an incredibly successful guy. He rules for almost 40 years. And what gets him in the end is sexually transmitted disease. Okay. After his death, the kingdom is split between his three surviving sons. One of the sons that almost survived was killed a day or two before Herod died on the orders of his father, because this guy had been the heir apparent, and then Herod thought he was plotting to have him put away. So the son gets put into prison, and then word comes to the son that his father is dead. So he says, yay, I'm the king. Trouble was, Herod wasn't yet dead, so that son gets his head chopped off as well. It was pretty tough being a member of Herod's family, and one of the Roman emperors actually joked he'd rather be a pig than to be a member of Herod's family, because Herod doesn't eat pigs because he's Jewish. I would survive better as a pig. So the three boys, there's Archelaus and Philip and Antipas, half-brothers and full brothers because of all the different wives. Archelaus gets given half the kingdom, which includes Jerusalem and Samaria, and he's such a disaster that after 6 years he gets pensioned off and sent to his father's estate in the south of France, where he lives in retirement and dies of natural causes. That's a tough punishment, isn't it? Being sent to a resort in the south of France. From 6 AD or 6 CE onwards, Jerusalem and Samaria, Judea and Samaria, are under direct Roman rule, and at least from 26 to 36, and possibly as early as 18 to 36, Pontius Pilate is the procurator, the Roman official, the procurator of this particular province. The other two bits stay with Herod's sons, but Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria is under the direct Roman administration. And for at least from 26 through to 36, and possibly from 18 through to 36, the guy in charge is Pontius Pilate, and he's a interesting piece of work. Again, it's hard to get a good judgment on him because obviously Christians didn't like him, and we got to write the history books. Okay, but even contemporary Roman accounts describe him as a bit of a harsh, dictatorial ruler. Very concerned about his reputation, not at all concerned about the well-being of the people he was ruling. And the fact that he was there for so long indicates that he was keeping the place under control. Had he not been efficient, he wouldn't have been there even for 10 years, let alone 15 or 20 years. Okay? So this is the period, 26 to 36. This is when John the Baptist is going to flourish and be killed, and it's also when Jesus is going to be flourishing as a young adult, coming to public notice and being killed. It's all going to happen somewhere in this period, in 26 and 36. The normally agreed dates is that John the Baptist appears to have been killed by one of Herod's sons, a guy called Antipas, Herod Antipas. He has John the Baptist murdered in what we call the year 28. And according to the Gospels, when Jesus gets word of John being arrested, that's kind of the trigger for Jesus to start doing his stuff. Okay? And then not long afterwards, Jesus getting word that John has died and presumably thinking, I'm going to have to watch my step here. If they've just killed my mentor and teacher, they're probably going to be watching me very closely as well. So the date that lots of us will suggest, lots of scholars will suggest, is actually the 2nd of April in the year 30, is probably the date of the crucifixion. But as Bill has mentioned, because that's linked to the date of Passover, and Passover is linked to the full moon closest to the spring equinox, because the dates shift around, as we know, and that's why Easter moves around. So these are 5 or 6, if you count this one, 5 or 6 moments, dates, which shape the New Testament and shape the story of Jesus. And the dominant reality here is we're still in what is called Second Temple Judaism. Okay, so you've got the first temple back in the time of David and Solomon and down to Nebuchadnezzar. Temple destroyed. It's eventually rebuilt. Herod himself, of course, totally rebuilds the temple, does a big refurb, gets all the approvals from the Office of Environment and Heritage, and he just totally rebuilds the cathedral in Jerusalem called the Temple. Okay? Makes it massive, massive place. And in one level, it's a job creation scheme. It soaks up unemployment. And if people are not standing around the streets unemployed, they're not causing trouble. Keep them busy, keep them happy, keep them off my back. Okay? So there's 5 dates that give us it doesn't tell us when Jesus was born. It doesn't tell us when he said the parable of the sower or anything like that. But we know that the life of Jesus has to be somewhere between Herod the Great and Pontius Pilate. It's got to be somewhere in there. It can't be anywhere else. So to that extent, the dates are useful. Hopefully. Okay, so now we move from the story being within the context of Second Temple Judaism, and we begin to talk about Christian beginnings. So now we're sort of, on this list earlier, now we're starting to move into this stuff. We don't have many dates to work with. We don't actually have a clear date for when Paul becomes a Christian. Okay? We can try and work back from some other things, and if Jesus dies in the year 30, then we're looking at a 5 or 6 year period, and something has happened in between, and by Paul's own account, in various places, Paul describes himself as a Jewish head kicker who was actively involved in trying to suppress the Jesus movement and squash it, stamp it out. Okay, so he's doing that for at least a few years after Easter and before he becomes a Christian himself. Again, even saying becomes a Christian, there was no such thing as a Christian at this stage. That word hadn't been invented. but it's a word we use, so let's do that. So, working back from some of the things Paul writes about in Galatians and so on, one of the estimates is that Paul's transition from being a Jewish opponent of the Jesus movement to be an active participant and leader within the Jesus movement takes place about the year 36. Okay, so within 5 or 6 years of Easter. The so-called Council of Jerusalem, which is described in the book of Acts in chapter 15, is dated, you'll know it, around 49 to 50, year 49 to 50. Okay? And it's mentioned in the book of Acts. It's also mentioned in Paul's letter to the Galatians. So that allows us to get a bit of a handle on it. In the book of Acts, there's reference to Paul being dragged in before Gallio, who was the proconsul in Corinth, and we happen to know the year, the one and only year, when he was there as proconsul. So actually, the date of this guy Gallio, it's one of the very few absolute dates for early Christianity, and it's not actually all that important to the story, but it does give us there's nail that one down. That's one that we can be sure about. Okay. The New Testament doesn't tell us so, but the tradition tells us that Paul was executed during the reign of Nero after the fire of Rome, and so that's commonly dated around about the year 64. But we actually have no historical data to go with there. But early in the reign of Nero. And then we have one big piece of data, and a hugely important bit of data. In the year 66, there's a revolt by Jewish people in Jerusalem. They revolt against paying taxes to Rome, which means they're declaring themselves independent. And I should have thought to bring up one of my treasures is a coin issued in the second year of the rebel government. Okay, in the year 68. The numbers slip around a little bit. So this was a fully functioning local government issuing coins, organising its military defences, and so on. And initially was actually led and supported by members of the Jerusalem elite. One of them was a guy called Josephus, and he was actually the commander of Jewish rebel forces in the Galilee. He wasn't highly successful. I mean, no Jewish army was going to beat the Roman Empire. So, a bit like Herod the Great, there was some interesting how the role of the heroic or slippery individual. Okay, Herod the Great renegotiated his contract when there was a hostile takeover by the other side in the Civil War. Josephus is the leader of the Jewish rebel forces in the Galilee, and he's losing battle after battle. And he's eventually captured by Vespasian, who's the Roman general, and Josephus comes in with a great flourish and says something like, "I'm honoured to be standing in the presence of the next emperor of Rome." And Vespasian says, "Well, you can stay. Keep him around. He may be useful. If I become emperor, he gets a government pension. I don't become emperor, chop his head off." Okay. Josephus writes the history of the Jewish war from a pro-Roman perspective, while living on a government pension in Rome at the end of the first century. He's just a tad biased. It's all about him and his wonderful contributions to rescuing the Jewish nation. So out of this revolt, Jerusalem is destroyed. There's not only a Roman army fighting against the rebels, there's a pro-Roman Jewish army led by Agrippa II, grandson of Herod the Great, who is technically king of the Jews. And he's leading a pro-Roman Jewish army against the rebels because he wants his job back as king of the Jews. Unfortunately, despite orders to the contrary, somebody set fire to the temple and burnt the thing to the ground. It was meant to be captured and kept intact, handed back to Agrippa. That Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, but Agrippa continued with the job. His business card said, King of the Jews, until he died in 96. And his court was up at Caesarea Philippi, way up in the north. And I've taken groups of people through his palace. And it is beautifully built. It is also like the War Memorial in Canberra. The stonework is, 2,000 years later, is magnificent. In fact, Josephus sent drafts of his History of the Jewish War to Agrippa to proof check, to proofread his draft before it got published. So this is part of the human story going on in the background. Agrippa II is the Agrippa who we see in the book of Acts, who interviews Paul in around about Acts chapter 26 and sends him off to Rome. Okay, this is the same guy. So in the mess of the Jewish revolt, we actually get some very distinctive individuals emerging, including Agrippa II and, of course, Josephus. So that's what we have to go with in terms of dates. So we know the overall direction of events, okay? But we can't put a date on the birth of Jesus because we don't know when he was born. Obviously, he was born because you can't kill somebody who's not already born. Okay? But we don't know how old he was when he was crucified. Okay? We can be. There are various complicated reasons. I won't bore you with the details, but there's a historical, theological set of arguments around the dates and the timing of Passover and so on, which is why some of us think that April in the year 30 was probably the time that Jesus died. Things like the Easter appearances, like the miracles that happened during Jesus' life, we can't date those other than to say, well, any miracles Jesus did, he did prior to April the 2nd in the year 30. And any Easter appearances come after that. But by definition, an Easter appearance is not a dateable historical event. To have a kind of encounter, spiritual, psychological, whatever encounter with somebody after they've died is not something that you can date and put a kind of, take a photograph of kind of thing. It's a different kind of, it's an experience rather than an event, if you like. So the other set of dates, which I haven't really been talking about in all this, is the dates when the New Testament begins to appear. Okay? So if we think about it, we know the sequence is Jesus is born, Jesus baptized, Jesus does stuff, Jesus killed, Easter appearances, disciples go out and start doing things, Paul becomes a disciple and so on. But the dating of the earliest Christian literature is the other way around. So the oldest bit of the New Testament are the letters of Paul, not the Gospels. Okay? And the letters of Paul are written basically during a 10-year period, effectively during the 50s. Maybe as late as 62 or so, and maybe as early as 49. But basically, the letters of Paul are going to be written during the 50s, not the 1950s, just the 50s. 0050, okay? The 50s. So, for instance, Romans is typically dated in the year 58. Corinthians is going to be a little bit earlier, and the 1st and 2nd Corinthians is like a file that probably has 4 or 5 pieces of correspondence between Rome and the Corinthians on two documents. But it's a number of different letters have been put together into 2 documents. When we say 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, we don't mean 1st and 2nd. We mean long and short. Now, I know that's probably not what you got told in Sunday school, but that's how the librarians did it in the ancient world. And if you look at it, 1 Corinthians is the longer of the two. 2 Corinthians is literally two. It's short, so it's actually Corinthians A, Corinthians B in the Greek manuscripts. And it just means the long Corinthian file and the short Corinthian file. And certainly 2 Corinthians probably has at least 3 letters in it, but it's on one document. 1 and 2 Timothy, again, 1 Timothy is longer, 2 Timothy is shorter. 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, longer and shorter, and so on. Okay, so, and all of Paul's letters, actually, in the New Testament, from Romans through, are organised in order of length. Romans was one of the last things that Paul wrote, if you think about it, because he's probably in Corinth, and he's planning to go west. He wants to go to Spain, and he's heard there's a Christian community in Rome, which he didn't set up, but he sends Phoebe the deacon there with his letter, which we call Romans, to enlist the support of the Roman Christians to fund his program to take the gospel to Spain. Okay? So it's one of the last things Paul ever wrote that has survived, but it comes first in the letters of Paul because it's the longest. The second longest thing is 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians goes there because it's addressed to the same people. So then you skip as you go through them. So the letters of Paul are arranged in order of length, because that was the filing system used in the ancient world. It's also the same system used in the Quran. The surahs in the Quran are simply arranged in descending order of length. Okay? Surah 1 is the longest, Surah 2 is the second longest, and so on. So it's just how the ancient mind organised things. Put all the big ones over here and the tiny ones over there, and shortest on the right, tallest on the whatever, single rank file kind of thing. So in terms of dating the events, this is our framework. In terms of dating the literature, the letters of Paul come first, and then the Gospels come later on. Okay? And that's a whole other topic sometime, but probably Mark is written first. Matthew is a kind of a second edition of the Gospel of Mark. Luke is, again, an update of Matthew and Mark, but it's written from a different perspective. And the Gospel of John is coming out of a totally different space from the other three. Matthew, Mark and Luke kind of hang together. John is in a space of his own. And then the other bits of the New Testament, things like Peter, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, the letter of James and so on, they're really hard to date, but they're probably later rather than earlier. If we think about them, in the Gospels, Jesus is commonly seen in the company of 3 disciples. 3 of the 12 are kind of his inner executive circle. Who are those 3? You get their names all the time in Gospel stories. Then Jesus went and he took with him Peter, James and John. Okay. So apart from Paul, who's obviously not in the Gospel stories, but he's generated all this correspondence which is in the New Testament, the rest of the bits are basically Peter, James and John. Okay. So alongside Paul, the early church put the witness of material connected with Peter, 1st, 2nd Peter, material connected with James, the letter to James, and material connected with John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. Okay? So interesting, the bulk of what we get, you've got the Gospels, you've got the letters of Paul, you've got all the rest, and all the rest is basically Peter, James and John. Okay? I'm not counting Jude, but then basically that's what you get with what's left over, as it were, at the end of the New Testament. So the letters of Paul are primarily written in the 50s or the very first couple of years of the 60s. The Gospel of Mark it has to be written, it doesn't have to. From a scholarly point of view, there are certain assumptions. Okay, so let's tackle those next. And it comes back to this point I mentioned earlier about the first century. If we think about the actual first century, that between the year 1 and the year 100, even that first century breaks up into 3 chunks really easily. And they're more or less the same size, not quite. The first 30 years, the first third of the first century is the lifetime of John the Baptist and Jesus. Okay? The middle part of the first century, from 30 to 70, is between Easter and the destruction of the temple. And that's when the disciples are starting to do their stuff and Paul joins the team. And it's all over and over by 70 AD because the temple's been destroyed, Peter's been martyred, Paul's been martyred. Basically, with the possible exception of John, all the 12 disciples are presumed to be dead by the end of that middle period. And think about it, of course, because if they're walking around doing stuff with Jesus in the first 30 years, then by the time you get to 75, they're getting on a bit, and by first century terms, they are seriously over the hill. Okay, because the demographics, the mortality demographics in the ancient world, is that very few people who are not members of the elite are going to live more than 40 years long. Okay, some of you have heard me say this during Lent, but basically, of the live births, half of the live births are going to be dead within the first 12 months. Half of those who are alive, who survive the first 12 months, will be dead before they're 4 or 5 years old. Very high infant and early child mortality rates. So you're already down to just a tiny percentage of the live births going into puberty when they might breed. Immediately there are all sorts of complications for the female half of the surviving population because there's going to be very low levels of maternal health and well-being. So complications to do with pregnancy and childbirth are going to kill a large number of the girls who survive long enough to have babies. And then for the rest, you've got disease and violence and of course ongoing high rates of poverty, all of which correlate with bad outcomes in terms of longevity. So unless you're a priest living a privileged life, or unless you're one of Herod's family but not too close to the old codger because you'll cut your throat otherwise, but unless you're in a fairly privileged social niche, if you get to 40, you've actually done pretty well. So if anybody who's around as a young adult with Jesus as a young adult, 40 years later, they've well and truly reached their use-by date in first century demographics. Okay, so we can assume we don't have dates, and this is the other thing about history. You don't always have dates, but you can put things in a sequence. So we can assume that hardly anybody of the people who actually were there at the baptism of Jesus, hardly any of them were still alive when Rome is destroying the temple. It would just be one or two, but it's going to be really remarkable for someone to live that long and still be able to talk about it. So you've got the first 30 years when Jesus is doing stuff. You've got the middle 40 years, and this is when the disciples are saying, see you, Kathy, that's when the disciples are saying, well, this is not over. There's still lots, in theological terms, Jesus is alive.
Excuse me, I'll see you.
See you on Wednesday. And then, of course, and that culminates with the destruction of the temple. The 74 is there because of Masada. So it takes another couple of years to mop up all the last few outposts of resistance. The temple is gone in the year 70. So then the final third of the first century, from 70 to 100, it's a whole new ballgame for Christians and Jews. There is no Jerusalem. There is no temple. There is no priesthood. What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? Do we go to the synagogue or do we not go to the synagogue? Everything, and there basically is nothing there to tell them. They've never been in a space like this before. Okay, so what do? They start to gather up They hear that some churches have letters that Paul wrote to them. Excuse me, could we have a copy of the letter from Paul where he talks about marriage and da-da-da-da-da, whatever. So they start to make copies of Paul's letters. That process will come to a culmination a little bit after 100. We know there's a collection of Paul's letters beginning to circulate. And meanwhile, the stories they've been remembering and telling about Jesus start to get written down, and that's the Gospel of Mark. And then Matthew says, really, Mark, you left out all this good stuff. So he does like a second edition of Mark, which we call the Gospel of Matthew. Now, that's got to be after 70 AD, and it's not going to be 71. Things don't happen like that. They've got no central, or there is no Christian headquarters. There's no Vatican. There's not even a Jerusalem anymore. So and Paul is dead, and Peter's dead. Imagine, how are you going to do this Christianity thing in around about the year 75? And what's the difference between 75 and 80 and 85? Not much is going to have happened to turn that around in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So although we don't know anything, we can't say this is when it happened. We can kind of say, well, basically, in the next 20 to 30 years after this, that's when the New Testament documents start to emerge. Obviously, Paul's written them earlier, some of his stuff earlier, but they're not becoming public property and being circulated and copied until after his death. And this is then, and what's going on in this next 30 years at least, after 70 AD, is Christians in effect are saying, well, are we Jewish or not? And basically all the Christians had been Jewish, with a few exceptions up to that point. But Jewish is rebel. Jewish is, well, you're not going to get a job in the government administration if your cultural or religious background is Jewish. Like, forget it. Okay? And when the Roman government is raising the taxes and conscripting people to go into the Roman army and be sent to Palestine to fight the rebels, the Jewish rebels, where are they putting up the taxes and where are they recruiting the new soldiers? In what we call Syria and Turkey. Because that's, you just walk downhill. Not quite downhill, but you know what I mean. In terms of the map, you're not going to bring them from Spain. You're going to forcefully conscript soldiers from Syria and from what we call Turkey. They called it Asia in our terms. Turkey and Syria is where they're going to raise the army to go and fight the Jewish rebels. And guess where the taxes are going to go up to pay for the war? In Syria and Turkey. Guess where the most number of Christians lived at the end of the first century? Syria and Turkey. Is it really cool to be Jewish in Syria and Turkey round about the year 80? No way. So the Christians are going, oh yes, well, Jesus was Jewish, this is true, but I'm a good Roman government supporting person myself, and so is my family. And the Jews are saying, so you reckon you're Jewish? So where were you? Where were you during the war? I didn't see any Christian battalions turning up to fight for Jerusalem. Where were? Oh, that's because we think Jesus is going to go. Oh, so you actually think Jesus is more important than the temple? Well, of course we do. There's the door. You don't need to come to synagogue anymore. So during this 30 years, the last third of the first century, Jews and Christians are going like this. Okay? And we haven't really been nice to each other ever since. That's the beginning of Christian anti-Semitism, which ends up at Auschwitz. Okay? That hatred and the fear and the enmity between the two communities culminates, sadly and disgustingly, at Auschwitz. So again, we can see we can see the trends. We know that in the first third of the New Testament, of the first century, from during the life of John the Baptist and Jesus, we know that the temple was the dominant institution. They were under Herodian and Roman control. We sort of understand what was going on. Between the death of Jesus and the destruction of the temple, Christianity is basically just like Cursillo. It's a way of being Jewish within the larger Jewish community, but slowly kind of becoming more self-aware of their own differences. But Paul, not only was Paul Jewish, by his own account, Paul is a Pharisee. Okay? So we often think that Jesus and the Pharisees were incompatible. Well, Paul would say no. Now, obviously, some of his friends didn't agree with him. By the time we get to 70 AD and beyond, anybody who knew Jesus personally is gone. Okay, there might have been one or two exceptions tucked away in a village somewhere, but for a rough rule of thumb, we can say after 70 AD, there was nobody left on the planet who'd actually seen Jesus in person or remembered hearing him speak. And that's exactly the time when Christians had to work out, so how do we do the Jesus thing when there isn't a temple and when there isn't Jerusalem? Okay? And meanwhile, the Jews are saying, how do we do the Jewish thing when there isn't a temple and there isn't Jerusalem and there are no more sacrifices and there are no more priests? How do we do this? So Jews and Christians are both trying to work out how to be Jews and Christians in the 30 to 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. By the end of that period, we're well on the way to getting the what's called the Mishnah, the Jewish codification of practices, and by the end of that period, around about 130 or 150, we've basically got the New Testament, although it has not been formally ticked off. The books exist. Okay, so this development is for Jews and Christians is what's going to happen basically during the 100 years after the destruction of the temple. So you've got a series of 100 years. You've got the 100 years from the birth of Jesus, which we call the first century. You've got the 100 years from the death of Jesus, which is like the beginnings of Christianity. You've got the 100 years from the destruction of Jerusalem. It's more like 80 or so, really, but let's say 100. And that's when you get the birth of the New Testament and effectively the birth of the Mishnah, which is the codification of the Jewish oral law. What do you do? How do you be Jewish when you don't have a priest? So both Jews and Christians are doing this sort of parallel development as they codify their oral practices for a new set of circumstances. By the end, they're not talking to each other, but by the end, they've both done a very similar thing. One has created the Mishnah, the other has created the New Testament. Okay? Comments, questions, anything else? Yeah, we know that effectively the whole of the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, existed by that stage because we have copies of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah. So when the New Testament talks about according to the Scriptures, they mean, of course, according to the Torah and the prophets and so on. They're talking about the Old Testament or the Jewish Scriptures. So the Jewish Scriptures are there because they've been finalised and so on by the, before you get to the Hasmonean revolt, basically those things are done. Because we find copies of almost every book of the Old Testament. There are two exceptions, but almost every book of the Old Testament and a whole lot more besides are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are an amazing time capsule for early Jewish thought and literature. So we know that the Old Testament, to use our language, part of the Bible was there, and And then we see both Jewish communities and Jesus communities having this kind of, this is badly phrased, parallel but diverging processes. Independent, following more or less the same track, but at the end of the day ending up in two very different places.
When is the end of the day?
End of the day. Which day?
And then if they're going into the end of
Well, yeah, so that's this line here,
the day. It's
the
still
so-called
happening.
parting of the ways.
It's still happening at the end of the day. Or it is
well,
when the day has been reached.
where that at this point in history, where that culminated to our shame is the Holocaust. Auschwitz, so on.
Yeah.
The Holocaust, or the Shoah, Hashoah, as the Jewish people call it, actually, it says again, we get into theological thinking here. For some Christian theologians and for some Jews, the Holocaust changes everything. Okay? If God is not going to intervene when Hitler is murdering 6 million Jews, not to mention gypsies and homosexuals and Armenians and whatever, is there a God? Is there a covenant? What's the point of being faithful? Like, gas oven this way, what's the point of being faithful? Well,
It's Hungary, where the Germans predominantly Christians.
absolutely, yeah. Yeah. The Germans in the north are Lutherans, the Germans in the south are Catholics. The Germans in the east, which we call Poland, are of course Catholic. And that's where the death camps were primarily in Poland. That's where the death camps primarily were, of course, in what today we call Poland, Prussia and Poland.
And Hitler regarded himself as a Christian.
It's probably not a question he ever asked himself, but his culture and his tradition was certainly shaped by the German Christian cultural experience. Now it's very fashionable to say he was a pagan, but that's because we want to do the Pontius Pilate thing and wash our hands. Now, Hitler wasn't a child of our culture. Actually, he was. And if you read the text from Martin Luther, Martin Luther was calling on the German princes to burn down the synagogues and to destroy the copies of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament.
And I heard too that he wrote this modern term also to earlier after that he came to choose Orthodox and Christian Pride.
Yeah, well, so the topic was about the influence of the Passion Play, particularly the famous Passion Play over Gammarel. Whether or not Hitler went there, whether or not it was the critical point, it is true that think back to Shakespeare, the Merchant of Venice. Who's the evil character in the Merchant of Venice? Shylock the Jew. What does Shylock want? Money. He always wants money. And this is the stereotyping of Jewish people in Western Christian culture for hundreds of years. For almost 1,000 years, Jews weren't allowed on the island in terms of England. They weren't allowed to come. Okay? No Jews were allowed to set foot in Britain until you get down to the time of Cromwell, and for like 700 years or so before. So where does Shakespeare get his idea of the lecherous, greedy Jew from? He's not going to meet one in Stratford-upon-Avon. There are no Jews allowed in England in the Elizabethan period. Okay, total prejudice enforced by the instruments of state. But the prejudice against Jews was cultivated by Christian liturgies, particularly during Holy Week, Passion Plays, Good Friday liturgies, and so on. Yeah. So the parting of the ways. But one of the good things that's happened is that Christians and Jews, Christian theologians, Jewish theologians, are talking to each other. Christians are able now to acknowledge whether or not Hitler was driven by Christian principles. We can acknowledge what Christianity contributed to the anti-Semitism which made the Holocaust possible. And one of the things is we now have, and we'll talk about this other times, until very recently, it wasn't at all fashionable to talk about Jesus the Jew. Okay? And now we're reclaiming the Jewishness of Jesus. That's really only happened since the Holocaust. If you read good German scholarship, because they were the best religion scholars, if you look at good German scholarship from the late 1800s, it is dripping with anti-Semitism, just dripping with anti-Semitism. That was the culture of the universities. That was the culture of the church. So the flip side of that is I have a very good friend, Jewish friend in Israel called Richard Sherwin, he's called Dick to his friends. He writes poetry in Hebrew, but fortunately for me, he translates it in English as well. But he writes poetry in Hebrew as a Jew about Jesus. Okay, and some of it is very confronting to read, because for Jewish people who are alive today, Jesus can be hardly ever anything other than a curse. The name of Jesus is not a word that makes them think warm fuzzy. You know? Jesus represents 2,000 years of persecution by Christian culture. Now, we don't. It's not us. We don't feel that. It's like white privilege. We don't sense it. So to read some of Dick's poetry, I can give you some copies if you like. But to read his poetry about, he identifies with Jesus and what happened to Jesus on the cross. He'll say things in his poetry. He'll say things like, "I'm really sorry what happened to you, Jesus, but your guys have been doing that to us for the last 2,000 years." And he's dead right. It's not just the Holocaust. It goes right back to St. John Chrysostom, goes right back to John's Gospel. Who are the enemies of Jesus in the Gospel of John? The Jews. Not the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Sadducees, the Zealots, whatever. It's the Jews in John's Gospel. Okay, so this is a real big issue. Paul, of course, is a huge influence on the eventual, in this process, and what happens after Easter, and what are the disciples up to, and what difference does Paul make? Paul makes a huge difference. I don't want to say that Paul invented Christianity, but Paul helps the followers of Jesus to really get their ideas together. In modern commercial terms, we'd say he was the vice president for marketing and communication. He really got the product established out in the Gentile marketplace. We've talked about the Gospels. We talked about this last week, and I'm sure it'll come up time and time again. And in terms of, because then one of the questions for us is how historical is the Jesus tradition, the stories about Jesus? Some people will say, well, every single bit of it really happened because it's in the Bible. Others will say, well, the other extreme, there are people say, well, we don't even think Jesus existed. It's all made up. Not too many Christians found at that end of the spectrum. In between, of course, there are various positions people adopt, including, well, some bits are legendary, some bits are exaggerated, but the underlying story is historical or whatever. So you get kind of varieties of positions to do with the Jesus story. And while for Christians, sometimes it's not so hard to say that some bits of the Old Testament didn't really happen, to say that some bits of the Jesus story didn't really happen, that makes us a bit uncomfortable. Okay. So these are not issues we're going to solve in the next 30 seconds. Just noting that these are some of the big questions that come out of this, and we've spent most of the time today, I guess, talking about this one. How can if the Jewish, even if we leave aside the Muslims, because they obviously weren't there in the first century, but What do we have to say to the world about justice and peace when we can't even be nice to each other as Christians and Jews? What's our gospel? Are we just selling fire insurance for the next life? Do we have nothing to offer for this life? Yeah? What's the product? What's the good news? Okay. All right. So let's leave it there. We'll do something next week's totally different.